Prime Minister Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim has unveiled Malaysia's annual spending plan for next year, the country's largest supply bill tabled yet. In his speech, he said that it will have three thrusts: delivering reforms to enhance governance and public delivery system, transforming the economy and businesses, and elevating the well-being of the rakyat. Here are some of the key economic highlights for Budget 2024. The government is planning to spend 393.8 billion ringgit, though higher than the 388.1 billion initially allocated for 2023. The figure is lower than last year's revised figure of 397.1 billion ringgit. A record 303.8 billion will be set aside for OPEX and 90 billion for development spending. Meanwhile, revenue is seen coming in at 307.6 billion ringgit. Economic growth is seen growing at between 4 and 5%. Headline inflation is at 2.1 to 3.6%, while the jobless rate is expected to improve to 3.4%. Fiscal deficit is projected at 4.3% of GDP. And now, some of the key takeaways of Budget 2024. Given the optics and repeated insistences from his administration that reforms to Putrajaya's fiscal health has now become crucial rather than simply necessary, it is no surprise that Budget 2024 would include belt-tightening in the form of subsidy cuts. While it was reported before, Anwar made it official that targeted subsidies will be implemented in phases next year. For 2024, the government has made available 58.1 billion in various subsidies, incentives and aids, where almost 50% is for cost control for the public. PM pointed out that the government's earlier implementation of a targeted subsidy for electricity, where the heavier users, around 10%, were no longer subsidized, had managed to save the government over 4.6 billion this year. This approach will be further improved according to consumption level going forward. While petrol wasn't mentioned, Anwar announced that diesel subsidies would be rationalized in stages, revealing that the government currently pays 1 ringgit 60 to keep the price at 2 ringgit 15. He calls it a proactive move to combat wastage and smuggling. However, logistics companies and certain groups will continue to have access to subsidized diesel. He also announced the lifting of price controls for chickens and eggs, allowing prices to float in order to ensure a sufficient supply for the market. The government will then channel these savings to boost cash assistance through the Rahmah Cash Contribution or Sumbangan Tunai Rahmah, increasing the allocation from 8 billion to 10 billion ringgit. The hardcore poor will also continue to have their electricity subsidized, with Putrajaya providing an additional 55 million rebate for 142,000 households at 40 ringgit per month. But there is no such thing as a free lunch, and this is where the higher taxes come in. The headline being the highest service tax, which will be increased from 6 to 8%. While doing this can be seen as the government's attempt to sidestep implementing the hugely unpopular GST, Putrajaya increased the scope to include logistics services, brokerage and underwriting, as well as karaoke. However, Anwar said that it would exclude F&B and telecommunications, softening the cost of living blow somewhat. The luxury goods tax has also been set at between 5 to 10% and will be imposed on items such as jewellery and watches beyond a certain price threshold. The excise duty on pre-mixed sugary beverages will be increased from 40 cent per litre to 50 cent per litre. Budget 2024 did include some efforts to bring up the rakyat in terms of skills. The tax relief of up to 2,000 ringgit for the fees of skills courses or self-improvement courses will be extended up to the 2026 assessment year. The scope will also be expanded to include courses such as photography, language and sewing. Finally, in order to help more Malaysians manage their retirement funds, PM announced the creation of a flexible EPF account where contributors can access it at any time. Still on taxes, the government is planning a 10% capital gains tax on the disposal of non-listed shares by corporate shareholders beginning March. It is, however, considering exemption for share transactions tied to IPOs, internal restructuring and venture capital. Meanwhile, the IRB will implement mandatory e-invoicing on taxpayers with annual income exceeding 100 million ringgit from next August. The same will be enforced by other income categories by July 2025. Also in the works, a global minimum tax for companies with global revenue of at least 750 million euros in 2025. The government is also looking to continue the tax exemption for fund management companies managing SRI funds and tax deduction on SRI Sukuk issuance costs until assessment year 2027. It's also extending tax incentives for angel investors until end 2026. Also, the MOF, IRB and Petronas are studying tax incentives for carbon capture and storage and hydrogen sulfide projects. The government is also proposing to make Pengerang Integrated Petroleum Complex a development hub of the chemical and petrochemical sector and will look at rolling out tax incentives. To encourage companies to invest in high growth and high value areas, it's looking at a tiered reinvestment tax incentive in the form of an investment tax allowance of 70 to 100%. GLICs will provide up to 1.5 billion to encourage startups to venture into these fields via BNM, BSN and Tekun, financial facilities amounting to 2.4 billion ringgit to be made available to MSMEs. Assistance will also be provided to businesses in the form of training. HRD Corp will utilize 1.6 billion to provide such exercises. It will also reallocate 15% of total levy collections to implement the Madani training program for MSMEs and vulnerable groups. The annual budget's key priority remains education, with MOE receiving the lion's share of 58.7 billion ringgit. Of this sum, 2.5 billion will be set aside to build 26 new schools and 1.9 billion will go towards upgrading existing facilities. Meanwhile, 16.3 billion will go to the Ministry of Higher Education. For MOH, its allocation is 13.5% higher at 41.2 billion, the biggest increase among ministries. 5.5 billion will be for medicines and vaccines. And to address congestion at state hospitals, 200 million will be set aside for the outsourcing of patients to military, university and private hospitals. As for the plantation and commodities sector, the government will provide 2.4 billion to FELDA, FELCRA and RISDA to boost agro-commodity activities and socio-economic development for smallholders. To support tourism, 2026 is now Visit Malaysia Year. Putrajaya is targeting 26.1 million foreign arrivals, with visitor spending to reach 97.6 billion ringgit. 350 million will be budgeted for promotional and tourism-related campaigns. Also to be introduced, new initiatives under the Malaysia Visa Liberalisation Plan. These include the facilitating of approval for employment passes for strategic investors in key sectors. The government also plans to introduce long-term social visit pass for international students who have graduated to meet the needs of the industry's skilled workforce. Also, to improve the visa on arrival, social visit pass and multiple entry visa facilities to encourage the influx of tourists and investors, especially from India and China. For the electrical and electronics sector, the plan is to open a high-tech industrial park in Kerian Perak to build a wider ecosystem for the E&E cluster in the northern region. While 2024's 90 billion in development expenditure is lower than the estimated 97 billion in 2023, Putrajaya will continue to spend on infrastructure, but in a way that indicates what areas it will prioritize going forward. The administrative capital will serve as a low-carbon city model for the country, with government buildings having solar panels installed in partnership with TNB and Petronas's RE arm, Gentari. Also, the federal government plans to adopt EVs as official vehicles, with TNB, Gentari and Tesla investing over 170 million to build EV charging stations. Moving on to East Malaysia, Anwar said that in order to combat electricity supply disruptions, the federal government will support the implementation of hybrid solar power generation and the construction of an electricity transmission network in Sabah. As flooding remains a critical issue exacerbated by climate change, Budget 2024 included the implementation of 33 high-priority flood mitigation projects throughout the entire country at a cost of 11.8 billion ringgit. Another thing to note, the PM also announced an allocation of 5 million to increase the number of canine dogs in police, custom and bomber units, with the funds also going to improve their healthcare facilities. The federal government is also committing 1.1 billion to put an end to water supply issues in Kelantan, Sabah and Labuan in the form of water treatment plants and replacing old pipes. The government is also proposing to take over a few key infrastructure projects. It is negotiating with Sarawak to realise the transfer of Bintulu Port and the operation of rural air services to the Sarawak state government. Anwar also announced that his administration will take over the previously aborted multi-billion GDV Bandar Malaysia project so as to ensure that the land is best utilised for the people based on Madani values. And finally, Budget 2024 also places emphasis on roads and transport, the literal grease of the wheels of the economy. Starting with the tender process for 19 work packages for the Sabah Pan Borneo project involving 15.7 billion to be completed by November 2023. Budget 2024 also revived the construction of 5 LRT stations that were previously cancelled, expected to cost 4.7 billion. The stations are Tropicana, Temasha, Raja Muda, Bukit Raja and Bandar Botanic. It will also proceed with the Penang LRT project. Syarikat Prasarana, the government's public transport manager, will add 150 electric buses to its fleet and funds amounting to 600 million ringgit to build 3 bus depots that will support the LRT3 project.